It is to be regretted that there is something offensive in the word. I have sought in vain for another, for I would not wish at any time, and especially just now, to add an irritating word to our disagreements. Therefore, whether I am believed or not, I declare that I do not mean to impugn the intentions nor the morality of anybody. I am attacking an idea that I believe to be false, a system that appears to me to be unjust, and this is so independent of intentions that each of us profits by it without wishing it, and suffers from it without being aware of the cause. Any person must write under the influence of party spirit or of fear, who would call into question that sincerity of protectionism, of socialism, and even of communism, which are one and the same plant in 3 different periods of its growth. All that can be said is that plunder is more visible by its partiality in protectionism and by its universality in communism, whence it follows that of the 3 systems, socialism is still the most vague and the most undefined, and consequently the most sincere. Be that as it may, to conclude that legal plunder has one of its roots in misconceived philanthropy is evidently to put intentions out of the question. With this understanding, let us examine the value, the origin, and the tendency of this popular aspiration which pretends to realize the general good by general plunder. The socialists say, since the law organizes justice, why should it not organize labor, instruction, and religion? Why? Because it could not organize labor, instruction, and religion without disorganizing justice. For remember that law is force, and that consequently the domain of the law cannot properly extend beyond the domain of force. When law and force keep a man within the bounds of justice, they impose nothing upon him but a mere negation. They only oblige him to abstain from doing harm. They violate neither his personality, his liberty, nor his property. They only guard the personality, the liberty, the property of others. They hold themselves on the defensive. They defend the equal right of all. They fulfill a mission whose harmlessness is evident, whose utility is palpable, and whose legitimacy is not to be disputed. This is so true that, as a friend of mine once remarked to me, to say that the aim of the law is to cause justice to reign is to use an expression that is not rigorously exact. It ought to be said, the aim of the law is to prevent injustice from reigning. In fact, it is not justice that has an existence of its own, it is injustice. The one results from the absence of the other. But when the law, through the medium of its necessary agent, force, imposes a form of labor, a method, or a subject of instruction, a creed, or a worship, it is no longer negative. It acts positively upon men. It substitutes the will of the legislator for their own will, the initiative of the legislator for their own initiative. They have no need to consult, to compare, or to foresee. The law does all of that for them. The intellect is for them a useless encumbrance. They cease to be men. They lose their personality, their liberty, their property. Try to imagine a form of labor imposed by force. That is not a violation of liberty. A transmission of wealth imposed by force. That is not a violation of property. If you cannot concede in reconciling this, you are bound to conclude that the law cannot organize labor in industry without organizing injustice. When from the seclusion of his office a politician makes a view of society, he is struck with the spectacle of inequality that presents itself. He mourns over the sufferings that are a lot of so many of our brethren, sufferings whose aspect is rendered yet more sorrowful by the contrast of luxury and wealth. He ought perhaps to ask himself whether such a social state has not been caused by the plunder of ancient times, exercised in the way of conquests, and by plunder of more recent times, effected through the medium of the laws. He ought to ask himself whether, granting the aspiration of all men to well-being and improvement, the reign of justice would not suffice to realize the greatest activity of progress and the greatest amount of equality compatible with that individual responsibility that God has awarded as a just retribution of virtue and vice. He never gives this a thought. His mind turns towards combinations, arrangements, legal, or factitious organizations. He seeks the remedy in perpetuating and exaggerating what has produced the evil. For justice apart, which we have seen as the only negation, is there any one of these legal arrangements that does not contain the principle of plunder? You say, there are men who have no money, and you apply to the law. But the law is not a self-supplied fountain, whence every stream may obtain supplies independently of society. Nothing can enter the public treasury in favor of one citizen or one class, but what other citizens and other classes have been forced to send to it. If everyone draws from it only the equivalent of what he has contributed to it, your law, it is true, is no plunderer, but it does nothing for men who want money. It does not promote equality. It can only be an instrument of equalization as far as it takes from one party to give to another, and then it is an instrument of plunder. Examine in this light the protection of tariffs, subsidies, right to profit, right to labor, right to assistance, free public education, progressive taxation, gratuitousness of credit, social workshops, and you will always find at the bottom legal plunder, organized injustice. You say, there are men who want knowledge, and you apply to the law. But the law is not a torch that sheds light that originates within itself. It extends over a society where there are men who have knowledge and others who have not, citizens who want to learn and others who are disposed to teach. It can only do one of two things. Either allow a free operation to this kind of transaction, i.e., let this kind of want satisfy itself freely, or else preempt the will of the people in the matter, and take from some of the sufficient to pay professors commission to instruct others for free. But in this second case, there cannot fail to be a violation of liberty and property, legal plunder. You say, here are men who are wanting in morality or religion, and you apply to the law, but law is force. And need I say how far it is a violent and absurd enterprise to introduce force in these matters? As the result of its systems and of its efforts, it would seem that socialism, notwithstanding all its self-complacency, can scarcely help perceiving the monster of legal plunder. But what does it do? It disguises it cleverly from others, and even from itself, under the seductive names of fraternity, solidarity, organization, association. And because we do not ask so much at the hands of the law, because we only ask it for justice, it alleges that we reject fraternity, solidarity, organization, and association, and they brand us with the name of individualists. We can assure them that we repudiate it is not natural organization, but forced organization. It is not free association, but the forms of association that they would impose upon us. It is not spontaneous fraternity, but legal fraternity. It is not providential solidarity, but artificial solidarity, which is only an unjust displacement of responsibility. Socialism, like the old policy from which it emanates, confounds government and society, and so every time we object to a thing being done by government, it concludes that we object to its being done at all. We disapprove of education by the state. Then we are against education altogether. We object to a state religion, then we would have no religion at all. We object to an equality, which is brought about by the state, then we are against equality, etc., etc. They might as well accuse us of wishing men not to eat, because we object to the cultivation of corn by the state. How is it that the strange idea of making the law produce what it does not contain, prosperity, in a positive sense, wealth, science, religion, should ever have gained ground in the political world? The modern politicians, particularly those of the socialist school, found their different theories upon one common hypothesis, and surely a more strange, a more presumptuous notion could never have entered a human brain. They divide mankind into two parts. Men in general, except one, form the first. The politician himself forms the second, which is by far the most important. In fact, they begin by supposing that men are devoid of any principle of action, and of any means of discernment in themselves, that they have no initiative, that they are inert matter, passive particles, atoms without impulse, at best a vegetation indifferent to its own mode of existence, susceptible of assuming, from an exterior will in a hand of infinite number of forms, more or less symmetrical, artistic, and perfected. Moreover, every one of these politicians does not hesitate to assume that he himself is under the names of organizer, discoverer, legislator, institutor, or founder. This will in hand, this universal initiative, this creative power, whose sublime mission it is to gather these scattered materials, that is, men, into society. Starting from these data, as a gardener according to his capricious shapes his trees into pyramids, parasols, cubes, cones, vases, espaliers, distaffs, or fans, so the socialist, following his chimera, shapes poor humanity into groups, series, circles, subcircles, honeycombs, or social workshops with all kinds of variations. And as the gardener to bring his trees into shape need hatchets, pruning hooks, saws, and shears, so the politician, to bring society into shape, needs the force which he can only find in the law of tariffs, the law of taxation, the law of assistance, and the law of education. It is so true that the socialists look upon mankind as a subject for social experiments, that if by chance they are not quite certain of the success of these experiments, they will request a portion of mankind as a subject to experiment upon. It is well known how popular the idea of trying all systems is, and one of their chiefs has been known seriously to demand of the Constituent Assembly a parish, with all its inhabitants, upon which to make his experiments. It is thus that an inventor will make a small machine before he makes one of the regular size. Thus the chemist sacrifices some substances, the agriculturalist some seed, and a corner of his field to make trial of an idea. But think of the difference between the gardener and his trees, between the inventor and his machine, between the chemist and his substances, between the agriculturalist and his seed. The socialist thinks, in all sincerity, that there is the same difference between himself and mankind. No wonder the politicians of the 19th century look upon society as an artificial production of this legislator's genius. This idea, the result of a classical education, has taken possession of all the thinkers and great writers of our country. To all these persons, the relations between mankind and the legislator appear to be the same as those that exist between the clay and the potter. Moreover, if they consented to recognize in the heart of man a capability of action, and in his intellect a faculty of discernment, they have looked upon this gift of God as a fatal one, and thought that mankind under those two impulses tended fatally towards ruin. They have taken it for granted that if abandoned to their own inclinations, men would only occupy themselves with religion to arrive at atheism, with instruction to come to ignorance, and with labor in exchange to be extinguished in misery. Happily, according to these writers, there are some men, termed governors and legislators, upon whom heaven has bestowed opposite tendencies, not for their own sake only, but for the sake of the rest of the world. Whilst mankind tends to evil, they incline to good. Whilst mankind is advancing towards darkness, they are aspiring to enlightenment. Whilst mankind is drawn towards vice, they are attracted by virtue. And this, granted, they demand the assistance of force, by means of which they are substitute their own tendencies for those of the human race. It is only needful to open almost at random a book on philosophy, politics, or history, to see how strongly this idea, the child of classical studies and the mother of socialism, is rooted in our country. That mankind is merely inert matter, receiving life, organization, morality, and a wealth from power. Or rather, and still worse, that mankind itself tends towards degradation and is only arrested in its tendency by the mysterious hand of the legislator. Classical conventionalism shows us everywhere, behind passive society, a hidden power under the names of law or legislator, or by a mode of expression which refers to some person or persons of undisputed weight and authority, but not named, which moves, animates, enriches, and regenerates mankind. We will give a quotation from Bossuet. One of the things which was most strongly impressed upon the mind of the Egyptians was the love of their country. Nobody was allowed to be useless to the state. The law assigned to every one his employment, which descended from father to son. No one was permitted to have two professions, nor to adopt another. But there was one occupation which was obliged to be common to all. This was the study of the laws and of wisdom. Ignorance of religion and the political regulations of the country was excused in no condition of life. Moreover, every profession had a district assigned to it. Amongst good laws, one of the best things was that everybody was taught to observe them. Egypt abounded with wonderful inventions, and nothing was neglected which could render life comfortable and tranquil. Thus men, according to Bastiat, derive nothing from themselves. Patriotism, wealth, inventions, husbandry, science, all come to them by the operation of the laws or by kings. All they have to do is be passive. It is on this ground that Bastiat takes exception when Diodorus accuses the Egyptians of rejecting wrestling and music. How is that possible, says he, since these arts were invented by Trismegistus? It is the same of the Persians. One of the first cares of the prince was to encourage agriculture. As there were posts established for the regulation of the armies, so there were offices for the superintending of rural works. The respect with which the Persians were inspired for royal authority was excessive. The Greeks, although full of mind, were no less strangers to their own responsibilities, so much so that of themselves, like dogs and horses, they would not have ventured upon the most simple games. In a classical sense, it is undisputed thing that everything comes to the people from without. The Greeks, naturally full of spirit and courage, had been early cultivated by the kings and colonies who had come from Egypt. From them, they had learned the exercises of the body, foot races, and horse and chariot races. The best thing that the Egyptians had taught them was to become docile, and to allow themselves to be formed by the laws for the public good. Fénelon, reared in the study and admiration of antiquity and a witness of the power of Louis XIV, Fénelon naturally adopted the idea that mankind should be passive, and that its misfortunes and its prosperities, its virtues and its vices, are caused by the external influence that is exercised upon it by the law, or by the makers of the law. Thus, in his Utopia of Salentum, he brings the men with their interests, their faculties, their desires, and their possessions under the absolute direction of the legislator. Whatever the subject may be, they themselves have no voice in it. The prince judges for them. The nation is just a shapeless mass, of which the prince is the soul. In him resides the thought, the foresight, the principle of all organization, of all progress. On him, therefore, rests all the responsibility. In proof of this assertion, I might transcribe the whole of the 10th book of Telemachus. I refer the reader to it, and shall content myself with quoting some passages taken at random from this celebrated work, to which in every other aspect I am the first to render justice. With the astonishing credulity that characterizes the classics, Fénelon, against the authority of reason and of facts, admits the general felicity of the Egyptians, and attributes it not to their own wisdom, but to that of their kings. We could not turn our eyes to the two shores without perceiving rich towns and country seats, agreeably situated, fields that were covered every year without intermission, with golden crops, meadows, full of flocks, laborers bending under the weight of fruits that the earth lavished on its cultivators, and shepherds who made the echoes around repeat the soft sounds of their pipes and flutes. Happy, said Mentor, is that people who is governed by a wise king. Mentor afterwards desired me to remark the happiness and abundance that was spread over all the country of Egypt, where 22,000 cities might be counted. He admired the excellent police regulations of the cities, the justice administered in favor of the poor against the rich, the good education of the children who were accustomed to obedience, labor, and the love of arts and letters, the exactness with which all the ceremonies of religion were performed, the disinterestedness, the desire of honor, the fidelity to men, and the fear of the gods with which every father inspired his children. he could not sufficiently admire the prosperous state of the country. Happy, said he, is the people whom a wise king rules in such a manner. Fenelon's idyll on Crete is still more fascinating. Mentor is made to say, all that you will see in this wonderful island is the result of the laws of Minos. The education that the children receive renders the body healthy and robust. They are accustomed, from the first, to a frugal and laborious life. It is supposed that all the pleasures of sense enervate the body and the mind. No other pleasure is presented to them but that of being invincible by virtue, that of acquiring much glory. There they punish 3 vices that go unpunished amongst other people: ingratitude, dissimulation, and avarice. As to pomp and dissipation, there is no need to punish these, for they are unknown in Crete. No costly furniture, no magnificent clothing, no delicious feasts, no gilded palaces are allowed. It is thus that Mentor prepares his scholar to mold and manipulate, doubtless with the most philanthropic intentions, the people of Ithaca. And to confirm him in those ideas, he gives him the example of Salentum. So we receive our first political notions. We are taught to treat men very much as Olivier de Serres teaches farmers to manage and to mix the soil. Montesquieu. To sustain the spirit of commerce, it is necessary that all the laws should favor it, that these same laws, by their regulations in dividing the fortunes in proportion as commerce enlarges them, should place every poor citizen in sufficiently easy circumstances to enable him to work like the others, and every rich citizen in such mediocrity that he must work in order to retain or to acquire. Thus the laws are to dispose of all fortunes. Although in a democracy real equality be the soul of the state, yet it is so difficult to establish that an extreme exactness in this matter would not always be desirable. It is sufficient that a census be established to reduce or fix the differences to a certain point, after which it is for particular laws to equalize, as it were, the inequality by burdens imposed upon the rich and reliefs granted to the poor. Here again we see the equalization of fortunes by law, that is, by force. There were in Greece 2 kinds of republics. One was military, as Sparta, the other commercial, as Athens. In the one it was wished that the citizens should be idle, in the other the love of labor was encouraged. It is worth our while to pay a little attention to the extent of genius required by these legislators, that we may see how, by confounding all of the virtues, they showed their wisdom to the world. Lycurgus, blending theft with the spirit of justice, the hardest slavery with extreme liberty, the most atrocious sentiments with the greatest moderation, gave stability to his city. He seemed to deprive it all of its resources, arts, commerce, money, and walls. There was ambition without the hope of rising. There were natural sentiments where the individual was neither child, nor husband, nor father. Chastity even was deprived of modesty. By this road Sparta was led on to grandeur and to glory. The phenomenon that we observe in the institutions of Greece has been seen in the midst of the degeneracy and corruption of our modern times. An honest legislator has formed a people where probity has appeared as natural as bravery among the Spartans. Mr. Penn is a true Lycurgus, and although the former had peace for his object, and the latter war, they resemble each other in the singular path along which they have led their people, in their influence over free men, in their prejudices which they have overcome, the passions they have subdued. Paraguay furnishes us with another example. Society has been accused of the crime of regarding the pleasure of commanding as the only good of life, but it will always be a noble thing to govern men by making them happy. Those who desire to form similar institutions will establish community of prosperity, as in the Republic of Plato, the same reverence as he enjoyed for the gods, separation from strangers for the preservation of morality, and make the city and not the citizens create commerce. They should give our arts without our luxury, our wants without our desires. Vulgar infatuation may exclaim, if it likes, "It is Montesquieu, magnificent, sublime." I am not afraid to express my opinion and to say, "What? You have the gall to call that fine? It is frightful, it is abominable." And these extracts which I might multiply show that according to Montesquieu, the persons, the liberties, the property, mankind itself, are nothing but grist for the mill of the sagacity of lawgivers. Rousseau, although this politician, the paramount authority of the Democrats, makes the social edifice rest upon the general will, no one has so completely admitted the hypothesis of the entire passiveness of human nature in the presence of the lawgiver. If it is true that a great prince is a rare thing, how much more so must a great lawgiver be? The former has only to follow the pattern proposed to him by the latter. This latter is the engineer who invents the machine. The former is merely the workman who has set it in motion. And what part of men to act in all of this, that of the machine which is set in motion? Or rather, are they not the brute matter of which the machine is made? Thus, between the legislator and the prince, between the prince and his subjects, there are the same relations as those that exist between the agricultural writer and the agriculturalist. The agriculturalist and the clod, at what a vast height then is the politician placed, who rules over legislators themselves and teaches them their trade in such imperative terms as the following. Would you give consistency to the state? Bring the extremes together as much as possible? Suffer neither wealthy persons nor beggars? If the soil is poor and barren, or the country too much confined for the inhabitants, turn to industry and the arts, whose productions you will exchange for the provisions which you require. On a good soil, if you are short of the inhabitants, give all your attention to agriculture, which multiplies men, and banish the arts, which only serve to depopulate the country. Pay attention to the extensive and convenient coasts. Cover the sea with vessels, and you will have a brilliant, short existence. If your seas wash only inaccessible rocks, let the people be barbarous and eat fish. They will live more quietly, perhaps better, and most certainly more happily. In short, besides the maxims which are common to all, every people has its own particular circumstances, which demand a legislation peculiar to itself. It was thus that the Hebrews formerly, and the Arabs more recently, had religion for their principal object. That of the Athenians was literature, that of Carthage and Tyre, commerce, of Rhodes, naval affairs, of Sparta, war, and of Rome, virtue. The author of Spirit of Laws has shown the art by which the legislator should frame his institutions towards each of these objects. But if the legislator, mistaking his object, should take up a principle different from which arises from the nature of things, if one should tend to slavery, and the other to liberty, if one to wealth, and the other to population, one to peace, and the other to conquests, the law will insensibly become enfeebled, the constitution will be impaired, and the state will be subject to incessant agitations until it is destroyed or becomes changed, and invincible nature regains her empire. But if nature is sufficiently invincible to regain its empire, why does not Rousseau admit that it had no need of the legislator to gain its empire from the beginning? Why does he not allow that by obeying their own impulse, men who would of themselves apply agriculture to a fertile district, and commerce to extensive and commodious coasts without the interference of a Lycurgus, a Solon, or a Rousseau, who would undertake it at the risk of deceiving themselves? Be that as it may, we see with that of a terrible responsibility Rousseau invests inventors, institutors, conductors, and manipulators of societies. He is therefore very exacting with regard to them. He who dares to undertake the institutions of a people ought to feel that he can, as it were, transform every individual who is by himself a perfect and solitary whole. receiving his life and being from a larger whole of which he forms a part. He must feel that he can change the constitution of man, to fortify it and substitute a social and moral existence for the physical and independent one that we have all received from nature. In a word, he must deprive man of his own powers, to give him others that are foreign to him. Poor human nature! What would become of its dignity if it were entrusted to the disciples of Rousseau? Raynal. The climate, that is, the air and the soil, is the first element for the legislator. His resources prescribe to him duties. First, he must consult his local position. A population dwelling upon maritime shores must have laws fitted for navigation. If the colony is located in an inland region, a legislator must provide for the nature of the soil and for its degree of fertility. It is more especially in the distribution of property that the wisdom of legislation will appear. As a general rule, and in every country, when a new colony is founded, land should be given to each man, sufficient for the support of his family. In an uncultivated island, which you are colonizing with children, it will only be needful to let the germs of truth expand in the developments of reason. But when you establish old people in a new country, the skill consists in only allowing it those injurious opinions and customs which it is impossible to cure and correct. If you wish to prevent them from being perpetuated, you will act upon the rising generation by a general and public education of the children. A prince or a legislator ought never to found a colony without previously sending wise men there to instruct the youth. In a new colony, every facility is open to the precautions of the legislator who desires to purify the tone and the manners of the people. If he has genius and virtue, the lands and the men that are at his disposal will inspire his soul with a plan of society that a writer can only vaguely trace, and in a way that would be subject to the instability of all hypotheses, which are varied and complicated by an infinity of circumstances too difficult to foresee and to combine. One would think it was a professor of agriculture who was saying to his pupils, "The climate is the only rule of the agriculturalist. His resources dictate to them his duties. The first thing he has to consider is his local position. If he is on a clayey soil, he must do so and so. If he has to contend with sand, this is the way in which he must set about it. Every facility is open to the agriculturalist who wishes to clear and improve his soil. If he only has the skill, the manure which he has at his disposal will suggest to him a plan of operation, which a professor can only vaguely trace, and in a way that would be subject to the uncertainty of all hypotheses, which vary and are complicated by an infinity of circumstances too difficult to foresee and to combine. But oh, sublime writers, deign to remember sometimes that this clay, this sand, this manure of which you are disposing in so arbitrary a manner, are men, your equals, intelligent and free beings like yourselves, who have received from God, as you have, the faculty of seeing, of foreseeing, of thinking, and of judging for themselves." Mabley. He is supposing the laws to be worn out by time and by the neglect of security, and continues thus. "Under these circumstances, we must be convinced that the bonds of government are slack. Give them a new tension," it is to the reader who is addressed, "and the evil will be remedied. Think less of punishing the faults than of encouraging the virtues that you want. By this method you will bestow upon your republic the vigor of youth. Through ignorance of this, a free people has lost its liberty. But if the evil has made so much way that the ordinary magistrates are unable to remedy it effectually, have recourse to an extraordinary magistrate, whose time should be short and its power considerable. The imagination of the citizens requires to be impressed.